I'd like to call this hearing to order, and before we get started, I want to welcome our newest member of both the full committee and the subcommittee, Mr. Russell from Oklahoma, who's had a very distinguished career in serving our country, and we're delighted to have you both on our full committee and on this subcommittee. Look forward to your input and help as we move forward with this markup and other things the subcommittee will be doing. Today, the subcommittee meets to discuss the role of surface forces in presence, deterrence, and warfighting. I'm particularly pleased to have two distinguished Seapower expert witnesses to testify before our subcommittee. Mr. Brian Clark is a senior fellow at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and Mr. Brian McGrath is managing director at the Ferry Bridge Group. Thank you both for being here and testifying today. We always enjoy reading your material, and we're looking forward to hearing you today. This committee's last hearing discussed the evolving maritime security report and the Navy's recently released report, A Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Seapower. Today we examine surface forces in this new environment, how we accomplish the transition from a defensive to an offensive surface force capable of operating and achieving objectives both independently and in cooperation with other forces. Looking at our naval surface forces today, we see a multitude of new capabilities are being integrated into the fleet. We are incorporating better sensors, including an expanded air and missile defense radar that's 30 times better than current technologies, and a new digital electronic warfare capability to deter, detect, or to better detect, decoy, and defeat incoming missiles. We're continuing to expand our anti-submarine warfare capabilities, including the addition of multifunction towed array and a variable depth sonar on our small surface combatants that will be able to better track even the quietest of submarines. We're fielding new missiles to better face the threats we face, including a long-range anti-ship missile and better short-range missile capabilities resident in the enhanced Seapower missile. Although we face severe fiscal constraints in research and development, there are new technologies available that the Navy will shortly be able to integrate into existing platforms. Advances in technology, such as the electromagnetic railgun and the laser weapon system, permit the integration of systems and promote the multifunctionality of systems. Instead of a multi-million-dollar missile, a single salvo from a railgun will cost less than $50,000. These systems represent a great opportunity to fundamentally change the cost curves in our favor. In addition to harnessing our technological innovation, our Navy is exploring a new concept entitled distributed lethality, a concept that would disaggregate and better arm the surface fleet, providing for a better tactical employment of our surface combatants by disaggregating surface combatants from a centralized carrier battle group may represent our best chance of creating a tactical force multiplier. By complicating potential adversaries' ability to successfully target future naval combatants, our Navy becomes more survivable and increases the probability that potential aggressors will decide to pass at future conflict. I continue to believe the most challenging capability or tactical problem that the Navy has to contend with does not reside within the department, nor is it posed by potential adversaries. I believe that the most pervasive and difficult problem that the United States Navy faces today is the will of this body to provide for a common defense and to not be lulled into a false sense of security. The idea of American exceptionalism is not idle words, but rather a unique American approach to our current challenges and future goals and objectives. We need to embrace the role of the United States, and especially the role of the United States Navy and Surface Fleet in particular, in maintaining and securing the global commons. As proponents of Seapower, we know that our nation's viability and future is linked to the strength and health of our fleet. I just question what we are doing today to ensure our next generation is able to enjoy the same benefits of life and liberty that preceding generations have provided to us. I look forward to hearing Mr. Clark and Mr. McGrath's insights on how the Navy can reach distributed lethality amidst fiscal constraints. And with that, I'd like to now turn to the ranking member of this subcommittee, Mr. Courtney, for any comments he may like to offer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both witnesses for your presence here today. Again, you've been sort of frequent flyers around this building, and much appreciated, because you know, there's obviously a lot in the short term with a mark just a few days away, but also, frankly, the longer view that I think you guys spend a lot of time thinking about in your experience and training really provides a very helpful guidance to all of us. I'm not going to read my whole statement here, but just sort of reiterate what the chairman mentioned is that the cooperative strategy for 21st century Seapower, which was released and we had a hearing on a few days ago, again, sort of focused on the fact that our surface forces are critical to making that strategy work. It faces, in many respects, almost unprecedented challenges. The Undersecretary for Acquisition, Undersecretary Kendall, spoke yesterday at the Sea, Air, and Space Convention with a packed audience and made the comment that he thought that the sort of changing technology and capabilities out there are about as threatening as existed back at the time of World War I, with the evolution of a lot of new platforms that people really hadn't even gotten their heads around. So that, obviously we really need to be focused on what you're here to talk about today. So again, look forward to your testimony. And Mr. Chair, I'm just going to ask the rest of my remarks to be entered for the record.
Without objection, they'll be entered.
And I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Courtney, and I know you served on a panel at that exposition. I know you represented us all very, very well, and I'm sure that you mentioned submarines at least once or twice in that panel. Not today, but thanks so much. Mr. Clark, it's my understanding you're going to start, and as I mentioned to both of you, we will put your full written remarks in the record, but we look forward to any opening comments that either of you may have. So we'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, sir. Chairman Forbes and Ranking Member Courtney, thank you very much for inviting us to discuss the role of the Surface Navy in President's Deterrence and Warfighting today. I'm honored to be here and to appear with my friend Brian McGrath. This discussion is timely as the U.S. Navy Surface Force is at a crossroads. At the beginning of this century, the Navy had planned to introduce a family of new warships, the CGX missile defense cruiser, the DDX land attack destroyer, and the sea control focused littoral combat ship. Now we look back and each of those ships is now either truncated or canceled, and we need a new family of surface ships to address the future security environment. The environment in which those ships was introduced reflected kind of that post-Cold War security environment where the Navy supported power projection ashore and its dominance at sea was unquestioned. The new cruiser was designed to protect U.S. forces from missiles launched from land. The destroyer was designed to use stealth to approach close to shore and use its guns to attack targets on land. And the littoral combat ship was planned to be used to address coastal threats like mines or diesel submarines and small boats. Today, the security environment is much different. In particular, sea control can no longer be assumed, and U.S. surface forces are going to have to expect to fight to gain and maintain access for the joint force in the future. Also, resources to address this challenge have and will continue to be constrained. So recognizing these trends, the Navy decided to end each of these programs that were involved in this new family of surface ships. But it now needs to come up with a set of new solutions that are going to address this future environment. That future environment is much different. Today, sophisticated anti-access area denial capabilities continue to improve and proliferate, threatening U.S. freedom of action and challenging the security assurances it provides to its allies and partners. At the same time, instability is spreading through the action of revisionist states such as Russia, China, and Iran. And there's also the failure of governments in the Middle East and Africa, which are increasing demands for U.S. forces to come in and help train and do security assistance with our allies and partners around the world. Fortunately, the Navy has some opportunities to address this set of challenges, both with instability and anti-access capabilities. In the next year, it's going to finalize specifications for the Flight 3 Arleigh Burke destroyer. It's going to determine the specific requirements for the new frigate that's going to be introduced. It's going to implement a plan to try to sustain its cruiser capacity. It's going to integrate into the fleet a series of new ships, such as the Joint High-Speed Vessel, the Afloat Forward Staging Base, and the Mobile Landing Platform. The Navy should take advantage of these opportunities to restore the ability of surface combatants to gain and maintain access for the joint force through sea control, and to also sustain the ability of the surface fleet to provide a stabilizing presence and provide security assistance and training to our allies and partners. I believe this is going to take 5 major actions on the part of the Navy. First, it's going to have to adopt an offensive mindset. Today's surface fleet is more focused on defeating enemy missiles and torpedoes than attacking the aircraft, submarines, or ships that have launched them. This puts us at the wrong end of the cost exchange and the wrong end of the missile exchange. The missiles that an adversary would have to launch to overwhelm a DDG's air defense would cost about 1/10 the price of that DDG. So it puts the adversary in a very advantageous position because of the way we are operating. Instead, U.S. surface forces need to focus on killing the archer instead of shooting down his arrows. That's the only way we're going to change the conversation and that exchange ratio. The number two thing we have to do is change our air defense approach. Our cruisers and destroyers today employ an air defense concept that uses the largest and most expensive interceptor missiles first, and only uses cheaper, higher capacity systems such as small interceptors or electronic warfare after the long-range interceptors have run out or failed. We need to instead engage incoming missiles closer to the ship with improved smaller interceptors and new electronic warfare capabilities and directed energy systems that will be fielded in the next 5 years. Third, we need to take the defensive workload off of our large surface combatants. Our cruisers and destroyers should be the offensive workhorses of the surface fleet, but instead they are consigned to a bunch of defensive missions that are going to come because we have no other way to provide air defense to forces ashore or forces at sea, as well as escorting convoys and logistics ships in wartime. One way we could do that is to make sure that the Navy's new frigate will be able to do air defense. Another way we can do that is by looking at ways to shift ballistic missile defense missions, which are an increasing demand signal on the surface Navy, to shore systems that are able to do those missions much more efficiently in certain locations. Four, we need to expand our capacity for training and security force assistance from sea. Today, we only have half the number of small surface combatants that the Navy said are required, half. What that means is for all of those missions for minesweeping, for training, for maritime security like counter-piracy, we're having to use cruisers and destroyers instead of using frigates and other small ships like we've done in the past. We need to look at ways to be able to expand the ability of other ships, such as those in our logistics fleet or in support ships, to be able to do some of those missions instead of using our large surface combatants to do so. There's ways we could do that by adapting the LCS mission package concept and widening its approach and using it on other ships than just the LCS. Fifth, we need to adopt new technologies. Lasers, railgun, new electronic warfare systems, and unmanned systems are all mature, and we've seen examples of them being used in operational environments. The Navy needs to start looking at ways to integrate these into combatant ships to be able to take advantage of what they're going to provide in terms of higher capacity, lower cost, offensive and defensive capabilities. These actions would enhance warfighting, they would enhance our ability to provide presence, and the end effect of that's going to be deterrence. And that's what we're looking for from the Navy, because fundamentally the nation depends on naval forces to deter and defeat other forces in conflict. I look forward to your questions and the discussion that will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Mr. McCrath.
Thank you, Chairman Forbes, Ranking Member Courtney, and other members of the subcommittee for the invitation to testify here today on the role of surface forces in presence, deterrence, and warfighting. Surface forces play distinct roles in all three of these functions, with the capability of the ship generally determining how extensible it is throughout the range of functions. Generally speaking, the more capable the ship, the more extensible it is. That said, a new generation of threats, a decline in surface force proficiency in some vital missions, and a lack of operational imagination raise important questions about the future employment of the surface force in wartime. China's 20-year program of naval modernization and the development of its anti-access and area denial regime are in no small measure associated with their realization after the Taiwan Strait crisis of 1996, that American naval dominance in East Asia had to be contested. During this last 20 years, the U.S. Navy has gotten smaller, even as it has purposefully de-emphasized the capabilities that are now required to counter China's A2AD complex. After years of neglecting surface-based anti-submarine warfare and anti-surface warfare, we are now faced with a rising peer competitor who is forcing us to face this neglect. We have a surface force that is less capable of destroying enemy surface and submarine forces than its Cold War predecessor. We have a carrier air wing that has privileged short-range strike to the point where its effectiveness in traditional war-at-sea tasks is questionable. That question of the carrier air wing is one I hope we're able to take up on another day. In the future, sophisticated sea denial strategies, such as those wielded by the Chinese, will drive the U.S. Navy to look at seizing temporary and limited pockets of sea control in order to enable other follow-on operations. Something I like to call offensive sea control, though it bothers the purists. In an era of little or no threat, the Navy packed its defense around the carrier and it positioned itself close to an adversary in order to generate maximal combat sorties. Against a high-end, near-peer competitor implementing an A2AD strategy, this is no longer possible. The Carrier Strike Group will have to fight its way into portions of the ocean from which it can then execute strikes, and then quickly retire and/or relocate. In essence, this resembles an island-hopping campaign that you're familiar with from the Second World War, except whereas in those battles, islands were seized and then held to enable follow-on operations, in this paradigm, pieces of the ocean will be seized and held for some period of time, from which offensive operations are then conducted. Critical to any concept of offensive sea control is a more lethal, mobile, and innovatively employed surface force. We must begin to more holistically evaluate risk, and we must recognize that our current concepts of force employment provide a determined foe with increasingly less complexity. I look forward to a discussion with you today of creating operational problems for potential adversaries with more innovatively operated surface forces wielding powerful offensive and defensive weapons. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McGrath. And let me maybe set a stage, and I'm going to ask a number of things. It's not an exam, so don't feel like you have to answer each one of them. Take whichever one you want to set kind of the foundation of this. Both of you have talked about today how we have been planning essentially for an uncontested environment. We're no longer going to be in an uncontested environment. If I had General Welch here from the Air Force, he would say the exact same thing, that tomorrow we're not going to be in an uncontested environment. How did we miss that? I mean, did we go a decade or 2 decades just missing the fact that one day we would be in a contested environment? It seems like to me that was pretty obvious. How did we miss that on such a big scale? The second thing is, as we find ourselves moving into this contested environment, are we talking about the need to change platforms or concepts and strategies, or perhaps both? And then if it's changing concepts, how good are we at changing? I mean, for the longest time we were talking about air-sea battle concept. That was the big, concept du jour, and all of a sudden, zoom, it just got swept out, under the rug. And then the last thing that I'd like for you to kind of put in that framework, we're talking about the high-end A2AD stuff that we're looking at. But we looked at in the full hearing today, we had Admiral Locklear here, and one of the questions I asked, and I know both of you have looked at the new Office of Naval Intelligence report that just came out. It really talked about the military maritime buildup for China. And in addition to that, it talked about them putting out more naval ships this year than any other country, and more next year. But one of the things that particularly concerned me was it's not just their naval ships, but it's what they're doing in their Coast Guards. And their Coast Guard now, with the ships that they have in their Coast Guard alone, they're within like 68 ships of our entire Navy. And they are having huge capacity and capability increases. And I showed Admiral Locklear a picture, which I imagine you two have seen. I should have showed it to you beforehand. But it's of a Coast Guard ship that they have, and they have on it Tugboat 25. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it. It's painted white. And then I showed it a picture beside that of their amphibious naval ship that's just painted gray. But they're the exact same ship, And I worry sometimes that when we measure and hear the Navy talking, they're comparing our Navy against their Navy, but we're missing those lower tier aggressive fights. So putting that in perspective, how did we miss this environmental shift? Are we looking at platforms versus concepts? And then how do we take into account kind of this lower tier aggressive action we're seeing not just from the Chinese, but the Russians, the Iranians, and how does that play into what we're doing here? Either or both of you on that.
Steve comes for Abbott.
Okay, well, so I will go first. I'll tackle some of those. To start with the last one first, or to start with this overall question of, I guess, how did we end up in a contested environment without realizing that we were going to do so? A lot of that had to do with the fact that we were fighting other conflicts at that time. So during the post-Cold War period for about 25 years from the 1990 until 2015, we've enjoyed a relatively peaceful time from the Navy's perspective of not having to deal with a peer competitor. But for the first 10 years or so of that, there was really no competitor at all. And we didn't expect that the capabilities that Russia had developed would then be proliferated to a bunch of new actors. And then when that happened, we continued to rely on our existing Cold War systems to get us through. By upgrading them, we figured that they would be able to continue to provide us the capacity to defeat new cruise missiles, new weapons that the China and others were getting that were coming from the Russians, not realizing that at some point the number of weapons that would be able to be brought against us would exceed the capacity of ships to be able to defend themselves. And that's really the fundamental metric that's being exceeded here, is that more weapons can be brought to bear against us than our defensive systems can handle. And when we say a contested environment, that's what we're really talking about, is that we're going from a time when 1 or 2 missiles might get shot at you by a rogue state or a terrorist actor, to now having hundreds of weapons being shot at you by a state actor who's been able to buy them from the Russians. So that kind of accretion of capacity over time is how that sneaks up on you, and before you know it, you realize that you're now on the wrong end of the cost exchange and need to make a dramatic change to alter that. Part of what China's been doing in their pretty smart strategy of developing naval capability has been to develop the maritime services, the non-Navy Coast Guards and other surveillance services that they use that are not military but instead civilian forces that go out and use similar capabilities to go press their case on legal issues, so executing lawfare. We don't have, the problem that we have right now is that the U.S. Navy and the U.S. allies in that region don't have a commensurate or proportional capability to deal with what's called subconventional aggression. So what the Chinese do is they do aggression, but it's below the level of conventional conflict in the hopes that over time they're going to be able to gain an advantage in the competition for territories in the South China Sea and East China Sea. So we don't have a commensurate set of non-warship, non-combatant type capabilities that are able to be deployed in that region, and our allies don't have the same thing. So we're not able to assist them in a way that we might be able to, were we to equip our non-combatants in a way that would let them contribute to that. I would say in order to address these two problems, the higher end problem of dealing with a contested environment and the lower end problem of the subconventional conflict, there's going to be some changes to platforms, but it's going to be a lot of changes to concepts that are involved, because how we approach air defense in an environment where the adversary can launch more weapons than I have the capacity to handle means I need to come up with a new air defense concept. So I need to start looking at shooting down incoming weapons closer to my own ship than I would like to, because I need to be able to use smaller weapons, weapons with shorter range that I can have higher capacity with. And I can get into some more detail of that, but there's some specifics on there, but the technical limitations of those systems at a high capacity are such that they don't go very far away. So I gotta shift my air defense concept to be closer into my ship, which is a cultural change for the Navy. We like to shoot things as far away as possible so I can get multiple cracks at them before they arrive. We also need to change our concept for how we provide security assistance to our partners. So if China is using its Coast Guard to bully the Philippines or Japan, we need to think about having ships that are able to operate at that lower level. So we need to have non-combatant ships like JHSVs or Coast Guard ships or non-combatant logistics vessels that are able to go be out there to provide presence that are able to deter China from that kind of activity because U.S. forces are nearby, but without escalating it by having a warship there, because right now our only option is to put a cruiser or a destroyer in that region, and that's highly escalatory. And then the additional thing we need to do is look at our payloads. And so we may need to make some fundamental changes with regard to what kinds of weapons we develop and what priorities we put on weapons development. Right now, we build a lot of weapons that are designed for a single mission, and they're generally relatively large weapons with big warheads. In the future, we're going to have to look at weapons, look at our weapons capacity and maximizing it to get more offensive firepower. I'm going to need to go to smaller weapons that use smaller warheads and take advantage of their precision to get the same effect as the larger warhead weapons. And I need to look at shorter range weapons that perhaps can be smaller as well. So I can carry more of them on my ships, more of them on my airplanes to expand the capacity that I'm able to bring to bear against an adversary who's got a high capacity of his own.
Yeah, but thank you. Mr. McGrath, you want to take a bite of that? Especially, I know you've written a lot about distributed lethality. How does that play in that concept in both terms of offensively for us, but also maybe a cost imposition strategy against some of our opponents?
Yes, sir. Let me start with how did we miss it? We were busy. We were busy doing something else. Not everybody missed it. I think the Navy did a pretty good job tracking the desires and the actions of the PRC as it reacted to the event that I discussed earlier, that Taiwan Strait incident of 1996. The problem was that the rest of the military and the Department of Defense was doing very important today work, the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. I think the PRC was wise in when it picked its time to modernize. Again, our attention was elsewhere. Most of our attention was elsewhere. I think, though, that that dynamic has changed, and I see very positive signs here on the Hill, at the White House, and at the Pentagon with respect to focusing more appropriately on China as a peer competitor. You asked about changing platforms and concepts and systems. Everything needs to be on the table. We have arrived at a place where our Navy hasn't fought a war, a real war, in decades against another Navy or against land forces that were attempting to destroy it. The tactics, techniques, procedures, platforms, acquisition paths that we have placed ourselves on are not up to the challenge of a peer competitor that would wish to deny us what we consider our primary competitive advantage, and that is the projection of power from the sea. So I think everything has to be looked at. You can't look at it all at the same time and fund it all at the same levels, but you can think about these things, and I see a lot of thought going into evolution of the air wing, distributed lethality, the submarine forces, networked operations is just fascinating, the things that they're talking about. So I think the Navy's really leaning forward in that regard. As for air-sea battle, I think to some extent, when you say it was swept under the rug, some of that I think is a very positive sense of trying to put some toothpaste back in the tube and stop talking about it all the time. Talk about the things that you've made decisions, very, very important decisions to talk about, because those decisions and what you reveal has a potential impact and an effect that you have thought about and that you can measure. So I think the department has gotten a little smarter about how to talk about it. You asked about distributed lethality, and that's something the Surface Force is talking about quite a bit. Distributed lethality, or as I like to describe it, a concept in which the surface forces of the United States Navy are on an individual unit level made more powerful, and then to really optimize that investment, operated differently, not just in the sort of defense of the carrier battle group, although we still have to do that, defense of the amphibious ready group, although that must still be done, but to create mischief, to spread the adversary's ISR forces, to make them assign weapons to a lot more targets so that then any one target has a smaller number of weapons assigned to it. You're diluting, you're thinning his quiver before he ever shoots. These are reasonable operational ends that the surface force can pursue. A more distributed surface force in wartime is, I think, a laudable goal. The way the surface force operates in the presence and deterrence phases of operations is where we most likely are to sort of rub up against these non-traditional forces that you've described from the PRC. Quite simply, there aren't enough of our forces to be there and to be watchful and to provide a jaundiced eye at the operations that are ongoing. Oftentimes, these operations come to our attention because the nation that is who believes its rights are being violated videotapes the event, or even worse, China videotapes the event because what it's doing was planned in order to have a desired effect that it could then exploit later. I think we have to get more sophisticated about how we work with our allies in the region to respond to these events. Pre-planned responses in which escalation is controlled, in which the story that would be written is thought about in advance, in which those nations use the legal justification or the legal system to their best advantage. I have no problem with the Philippines, for instance, taking China to court. I think we should be encouraging nations in the region to use the UN and the Law of the Sea Convention to the max extent that they possibly can. I'm not sure distributed lethality has a real impact on that problem in presence and deterrence.
Mr. Courtney?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to both witnesses. Mr. Clark, you started off with taking us back to the beginning of the century and the shipbuilding plans, and the best laid plans obviously have changed. One of the sort of fallout that we're still wrestling with as a subcommittee is the cruiser change that you mentioned, and obviously trying to figure out a cruiser modernization plan that works, both in terms of the length of time that these cruisers can be available, and obviously fitting it into the rest of the shipbuilding plan. I'm just wondering if you had any comments in terms of the back and forth over the last year or two about what the Navy's proposed, Congress's response, and any possible changes even from here.
Right. Thank you. So the Navy had proposed originally to decommission about half of its cruisers in a money-saving effort, mostly. And then Congress came back and required the Navy to come up with a better plan, and there was some money set aside to be able to support that. And the Navy came up with, I think, was probably the best argument and the best plan going forward, which was to take those 11 cruisers, which are half the cruiser force, put them into a layup of sorts, and then modernize them over time, and then bring them back into the fleet some number of years later, so that they would be able to extend their lives and that they would be available out into the 2030s, and into the late 2030s, early 2040s. What that would do is a couple of things. So it would save the Navy some money in the near term because those ships would be largely demanned, and then the cost to operate them would not be borne by the Navy until they get brought back into the fleet. So there'd be some near-term savings, and then down the road, the Navy would be able to bring them back, have them back in the fleet at a time when it's having to buy the new SSBN, which is going to decimate the shipbuilding plan. It's going to be 40%, maybe more, of the amount of money that would normally be allocated to shipbuilding might be going to the SSBN and the carrier that would be built around the same time. So there wouldn't be much money for anything else. Cruisers would be available to help augment the capacity of the surface fleet. I think that was a very effective plan in terms of sustaining force structure, dealing with the fiscal constraints the Navy is under right now. The challenge with that, though, is that the Navy doesn't have a good track record of taking ships out of the fleet to put into some layup or inactive period and bringing them back. They tend to go to that inactive state, and then make their way eventually to decommissioning instead of going back into the fleet at some later date. So I think if the Navy could be held to account to ensure that those ships get brought back into fleet and showed that willingness by having money set aside to support the phased modernization that would occur, I believe that would be the best approach. Now, I think a compromise, the 246 plan, is a worthwhile alternative because it still helps extend the lives of the cruisers out into the 2030s, so they're able to address the crunch in shipbuilding funds that will occur in the future. It does save some money in the near term, so there are some benefits on both sides to that, and I think it's a worthwhile compromise. It'd be good to see the Navy put some money against it so that it would be clear that that plan was funded, though, so they'd be able to pursue it. Because otherwise, your only alternatives end up being keep them in the fleet, but have them at some level of operational capability that's not clear because they're not being modernized and they're probably not able to operate as effectively as the other cruisers, or decommission them entirely, which is not an alternative that's being presented. So I think the 246 plan would be good.
Mr. Courtney, my sense is that with respect to surface force structure, good ideas are in short supply. We're dealing mostly with the least bad ideas. And taking all the cruisers at one time and bringing them back slowly over a course of time, I thought was a reasonable response from the Navy to a financial situation that that they are having a tough time dealing with. 246 is I think a reasonable compromise between congressional interests and the Navy's interests. I do think, as Brian said, if the Navy had some money after 2019 in the budget to fund it, this would probably not be a conversation. There is very little money to be had given the number of things the Navy is trying to do, trying to build new ships and new submarines, trying to fund its deployed operations, trying to ensure that we don't so starve non-deployed ships of maintenance and modernization money that it becomes inordinately expensive to bring them out when it's their time to go. All of these things factor into the decisions they make, and quite frankly, when I see the Congress insert money back into the budget to keep cruisers in, if you were to do the same thing in 19, 20, 21, and 22, that would satisfy me quite a bit because I'd like to see this program go forward.
And just a clarification, to do the modernization, you have to have the money in. Is that fair for both of you?
Yes.
And at this particular point in time, the Navy has not put any money in their fight up to do the modernization, have they?
Only the ships that are being done this
Right,
year.
but they haven't
15,
done anything in their 5-year plan.
Right, I don't think there's anything after the 15
Yeah,
and 16 ships.
Good. Okay. Mr. Russell, our newest member of the subcommittee, we now recognize him for 5 minutes, and once again, we're delighted to have you as part of the subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you each for the very insightful overviews. A lot of challenges there. In the 1980s, you had kind of a whole restructuring of the moving to the future of our defense posture, and you did see a lot of ships that, to meet the need, were brought out of mothball. Some had been in and out of mothball for several iterations and performed magnificently. And, you know, Mr. Clark, with regard to the small surface vessels and what would be needed to perform some of those roles, is that an option that the Navy could turn to make up some of that capacity in the short term?
That might be. So one challenge we'll run into is it's expensive to take a ship out of mothballs and bring it back to a condition where it can operate on a frequent basis overseas. So that would be something to think about, is that these ships are intended to be relatively inexpensive ships that do these missions at the lower end of capability. So if we have to spend a lot of money to bring a low-end capability ship into the fleet, maybe that's not worth it. The first approach might be to go after some of the non-combatant ships that we already have in what's the national fleet. So if you look in the what the government owns in terms of ships, you've got the Navy and its combatant ships, which are warships that do their stuff. There's also logistics ships that the Navy has that could be used in some cases to go off and do some security cooperation activities, and they do already. They do exercises in some cases, and you could put mission packages on them that let them do different things than they do today. You could also tap into joint high-speed vessels, which are another form of logistics ship. You can go into some of our support ships, which include various salvage ships and repair vessels, and those things can be used for security cooperation and sometimes are. And then we can also go into some of the supply ships that are part of the Ready Reserve Force, which are reserve ships that we maintain in an operational status that are designed to be brought out within 5 or 30 or 60 days. That could be made operational and taken out, and they can use them for some of these security cooperation activities. And they're designed to be brought out, and it's relatively inexpensive to do so. So I might go up to those first before we then go into the mothball fleet and pull some ships out. But it's definitely an option, and it may be less expensive than we anticipate.
And it seems like a lot of the critical threats that we hear throughout with regard to advanced missile technologies. You spoke of the cost ratio benefit to potential opponents and how they deal with this. And I know everything from nuclear defense capacity with the ANTPY-2 radars to the Aegis to the THAAD, a number of other things. We also have a lot of allies and partners, our English-speaking allies in particular. We don't even have to learn languages to operate with them, and they have great shipbuilding capacity. Does that factor into any of the comprehensive strategy and presence even as we look to deal with some of that? And how do we get them up on systems that we find we're already in short supply?
So I'll let Brian answer too, but we do. So many of our allies and partners operate Aegis systems and similar systems, and they do deploy with us. So pretty regularly, a NATO or destroyer or frigate will go with a carrier strike group on its deployment and act as part of its escort ship umbrella, if you will. So we regularly do deployments where we take advantage of what allies and partners bring to bear.
Mr. Forbes mentioned the Surface Navy's distributed lethality concept, and I think part and parcel to that is the fact that we have allies that do have serious capability. The South Koreans have wonderful surface combatants. The Australians, the Japanese, the Indians aren't necessarily treaty allies, but they're friends, and we operate with the Indians quite a bit. So there is a great hunger within the sort of world surface force. Admiral Mullen used to talk about the 1,000-ship Navy. Distributed lethality is the 1,000-ship Navy with teeth. And I think that the ability that we have to integrate high-end ships of other fleets into our operations, it's almost built in. They have Link 16. We're using the same kinds of systems. On the low end, this is something the U.S. Navy has traditionally not done all that well, is small ships. And I was a captain of a ship. We all come up through the system, and we all would love to zorch around on really fast ships as lieutenants and be in command of those things, but they're expensive to maintain, a lot of them, far from home. And we wind up looking, especially in times of fiscal contraction, those are nice to have. And we concentrate on the high-end warfighting more so than that low end. I think when we find ourselves in a position to more appropriately fund naval power, we ought to put some money into the low end. We ought to look at some kind of a fast patrol vessel, heavily armed, 4 to 8, 200-mile surface missiles that we can build for ourselves and build for export, that we could potentially operate in joint bases or composite bases as a way of doing what I like to call maritime boots on the ground, economically showing the flag. We all have to recognize that these are ships of limited capability, but they show the flag and they're reminders of what's over the horizon.
Yeah, not far from a Lend-Lease type of approach from many years ago. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Langevin, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. If I could, I'd like to talk first about cutting-edge electric weapon capabilities that are being that are starting to deploy operationally, specifically the LAWS system deployed onto the USS Ponce right now in the Arabian Gulf, and railgun and advanced EW capabilities. These systems are, as you know, starting to become more and more mature and starting to make their way out to the fleet. And what I want to know is, obviously, the Navy is clearly planning further development, but could you provide your assessments of the Navy's plans and whether you feel these technologies could be responsibly accelerated?
So that's a terrific point. And the Navy right now is slowly integrating these new technologies into the fleet. And what you're seeing right now is an emphasis on some demonstration projects like the Ponce, where we take an existing system that's been developed in the technology world and bring it on and just bolting it down to the ship and seeing how it works. When you get to larger systems, they're going to require a little bit more of a footprint, more interaction with the ship's combat system and electrical power and cooling systems. And that's where you have to really do some engineering to figure out where it's going to go, how to fit it in, how to hook it up. The Navy has not yet got a good plan for how it's going to integrate higher energy lasers, so the kinds of lasers that you would need to be able to do missile defense, not the smaller one that's on the Ponce, but something more in the 300 kilowatt range. Those lasers are quickly maturing. I've seen in the last couple weeks lasers that get up at about half that power, and putting the two of those together, you essentially get to about the 300 kilowatt range. So in the next few years, they're going to be available. The Navy needs to be thinking about how they're going to put that into the next class of, or the next iteration of surface warships that it's developing. Similarly with railgun, the Navy's got a demonstration project that it's going to do next year using Stockton with a railgun on board, which is terrific. It's a great way to show the applicability of that kind of weapon to a ship. But again, there's not a thought or plan yet to integrate them into another class of warship, except perhaps a DDG-1000 down the road, which might be a good thing. But again, that's one ship, and it's a 3-ship class, so it's not likely to be able to translate into an additional number of hulls. So the Navy needs to think about, well, how would I take the railgun and put it onto a number of ships that would make it able to make a difference in warfighting?
Yeah, which exactly what you're saying is what concerns me, is that the technologies are maturing faster than what may realize, and my fear is that these things are going to be ready, and we're not ready to deploy them in the capabilities in theater.
Exactly.
So, well, I appreciate the answer. Mr. McGrath, as you allude to in your testimony, there's a sea change occurring in the capabilities of undersea systems, including in how they might support surface action. And while submarines will clearly continue to be the nexus of such capabilities, how might advanced undersea systems and sensors play into the concept of disaggregated surface forces that you discuss?
Oh, sir, in a big way. Especially when the shooting starts. The ability of long-range unmanned undersea vehicles to deploy electronic warfare sensors, to employ weaponized UAVs that could then remove some of the threat that we discussed earlier to surface operations. There are so many, and I'm sure you've had some of these briefs, what we can bring, the combat power of them, what we can bring from under the surface of the ocean, because it's there, it's hiding, and the reaction time to it in many cases is negligible for an adversary. Huge capability. And I appreciate you bringing up the question, because what it does is it highlights the degree to which the Navy fights as a system We don't fight as a carrier battle group, we fight, or as an aircraft carrier, we fight as a strike group, we fight as an expeditionary strike force. We fight as a joint force. And so all of these weapons systems work together in a very, I think, a very robust architecture to support each other. So I think there is a huge role for subsurface launched sensors and weapons in helping to enable disaggregated surface operations. One very important way is to be able to put up long-range ISR assets, maybe some kind of a UAV that takes off, flies around for 8 or 10 hours, supports a SAG that's disaggregated, and then it flies to a land base and lands for recovery. That would be a useful capability. But I think the sky's the limit on how we can use the undersea force.
Very good. Thank you both, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman for his questions. You've been a leader on these technology issues, and hopefully this subcommittee can play a major role in helping the Navy to make sure we're moving faster at seeing how we can deploy them. So thanks for your question.
And Mr. Chairman, I should mention that although obviously it's appropriate to raise this issue with respect to the Navy in this subcommittee, the Navy has been a leader in trying to push these technologies that have been in the lab and get them actually into the field. The other services could take a lead from.
We just get greedy, and we want to get them there even faster.
Exactly,
So that's
exactly.
good, Jim. Now, would like to recognize the distinguished gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the Agriculture Committee, Mr. Conaway, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent a district that's totally landlocked. I don't have any ports. I don't have any shipbuilding. I don't have anything like that. So, and Mr. McGrath, it's probably the sea's the limit rather than the sky's the limit on that last phrase that you used earlier.
Stand corrected.
Mr. Clark, on your 5-point program, you made the reference to a kill the Archer issue versus what we're doing right now. Put some meat on the bone for that for me, given that the Archer's range is generally longer than the reach of a lot of our stuff that we're bringing to the fight. Help me understand what you're talking about.
You bet. So the Archers in this case are going to be aircraft, submarines, and surface ships that are able to launch anti-ship cruise missiles at our surface ships. Today, the surface ships we deploy don't have weapons that are able to reach enemy aircraft, ships, or submarines until we're already well within range of their anti-ship cruise missiles. So as Congressman Forbes has said, we're outsticked. The way you get out of that is we have to deploy some new weapons, and that's why I've got the emphasis on weapons there. So for the aircraft threat, the new SM-6 missile that's coming out, that's been deployed on a few ships already and is being incorporated with the new Aegis baseline, that missile is going to be able to reach an airplane outside the range of the airplane's anti-ship cruise missiles in most cases, or in many cases. So that gives us that ability to hit the Archer before he's in range to shoot his arrows. That's a good news story on the air side. We don't have a similar capability on the ship side. So if I want to shoot another ship and I'm a surface ship, I have to wait till I'm within harpoon range if I have harpoons even on board, which means I'm probably half of the distance that he can reach me. So I'm well within his weapons envelope when I do that. For submarines, it's even worse because my anti-submarine rocket that I've got on board of a surface ship has a range of about 12 miles. Whereas the anti-ship cruise missiles that Chinese submarines, for example, can carry have ranges of a couple hundred miles, and they can be launched comfortably from 100 to 150 miles. So I'm well within his weapons range when I'm able to shoot him. Now we might have a helicopter or something flying around that might be able to attack him, but that's only if the helicopter's in the right place at the right time and is able to do something about it. So we need new weapons that allow me to increase the range. So on the ship side, the Navy's developing the long-range anti-ship missile, the LRASM, that will eventually be going on to surface ships. I would advocate that in addition to being able to do ship attack, that missile also be able to do strike missions, because every VLS cell that I take for a strike mission is a missile cell. I can't use it for anything else. So we need more multi-mission weapons. And then for the submarine threat, we need to develop an anti-ship rocket that's got longer range. So if I do detect a submarine out, dozens of miles away, more, I can engage him right away and make him go away before he's able to mount an attack against me.
Dozens of miles is significantly shorter than 200 miles you mentioned
Right.
earlier.
Right, so it's, we could maybe develop an anti-submarine rocket that goes out, 100, 150 miles. That would be
So it's
able
all, it's all in the weapons packages and not necessarily
Right.
the
Right, so,
transport of those weapons.
Right, my detection capability may or may not extend out that far underwater, but you
Yeah.
certainly want the ability to reach out that far if you were able to get a detection.
I got you. And on your fourth point about expanded capacity for training equipment, I must have dozed off. Have me back up and go through that one again. You just talk about using different ships to do the training equipment mission that we're currently using?
Right, so normally when we want to do security
Hey,
cooperation.
stop laughing in the back. You saw me dozing off, so stop it right there.
Normally the kind of security cooperation or training missions that we do with partner nations, especially some of the less capable partners, we use small surface combatants to do that. We've used frigates in a lot of cases to do that over the last 20 or 30 years. Well, we don't have any frigates now. They're all being decommissioned, and we're only going to have half the
Unless you
number.
rename the LCS.
Right, and so we've got a few LCS out there, but not very many, and they would ostensibly pick that load up. But we only have half the number of small surface combatants that are required right now, and it's going to be below the requirement until well into the 2020s.
So that's more just a tactics issue. I mean,
So I'm arguing that we take some of the non-combatant
Right.
ships in the fleet and just take some of those mission packages from the LCS and instead put those onto the non-combatant ships and get the joint high-speed vessel and the mobile landing platform and some logistics ships to go out and do these missions instead. So the missions get done, but we're not having to do it with a cruiser.
all right. Well, thank you both for your comments, Mr. Moore. Thank you.
Mr. McGrath, could you follow up on Mr. Conaway's question a little bit too? Because we have really three concepts we have. We can block the arrow, we can try to blind the archer, we can try to kill the archer. I think one of the things both of you have talked about is that right now we have an overcapacity of trying to block the arrow, but technology is getting to the point where it's going to be more and more difficult to do that. So we're going to have to try to kill the archer. And can you kind of explain the trade-offs we have in those two concepts?
Brian came up in the Navy as a submariner. I came up as a surface guy, Aegis for most of my time. And so when Brian talks about his concept for air defense and he talks about waiting longer to take the shot, I start to get a little nervous. Because that's the human reaction that you have in a ship, is that you want to kill that missile as far away from you and from what you're protecting as possible. Range equals dollars. It's a very simple thing. Probability of kill increases as range decreases. Right? All of these things are interrelated, but the nervousness of a surface warfare officer remains. If I have to sit there and wait, it's a hard thing to do. And so when Brian and I have our arguments about this concept, I talk to him about there's a culture to overcome, there are training issues we'd have to overcome, and we would have to layer into this. So that's, what he's describing is the blocking, right? Killing that inbound missile closer to you at a more economical rate. That's fine. One of the other things that you can do is you can mess with its guidance. You can make it track something that is not you. Deception. The Surface Force and N2, N6 at the Pentagon are putting a lot of money into the CWIP Block 3 electronic warfare system that we'll put to sea on ships. The more we can defeat kinetic attacks with non-kinetic means, the deeper our magazines will get. The more we're able to integrate the weapon systems that Mr. Langevin was talking about, that are pennies or dollars a shot, the deeper our magazines will get. We have to maintain, though, the ability to reach out at range. Some percentage of those magazines has to be filled with weapons that can take advantage of the sensor volume that we have. That's been one of our problems for a long time in surface warfare, is we go out there and we bang away with a Spy 1 radar, or soon a Spy 6 radar on the AMDR, that's got hundreds of miles of range, but we could only take advantage of a small part of that search volume. The SM-6 helps us overcome that. So taking the archer out before he shoots his arrow is once again important, like it was in the Cold War. In the Cold War, we set F-14s out hundreds of miles from the aircraft carrier, and we had tactics that we developed. We had tanking that would support it. The outer air battle was something we took a lot of pride in being able to fight in. When that threat dissipated, we de-emphasized the outer air battle. We're gaining some of that back. I think, on a totally unrelated, not totally unrelated, the F-35 will need a longer-range AAW weapon, something like we used to, like the Phoenix that we grew up with on the F-14. We need a long-range air-to-air weapon so that the F-35 operating in this Naval Integrated Fire Control Counter-Air Environment, NIFCA, can get that Archer even further away. Maybe when he goes feet wet. Maybe you don't have to wait till he gets near his weapons release point. So the technology is there that we can exploit, but we need the weapons that exploit the search volume that we are able to generate.
I want to thank you both for taking the time to be here with us today. And as I mentioned to both of you before we started, I want to give you now whatever wrap-up time each of you need for anything you need to clarify, maybe elaborate, or that we didn't ask that you think is important to get as part of this transcript. And Mr. Clark, we'll start with you.
Thanks, sir. So one thing I'll note is the new technologies we talked about that could be used for air defense. So railgun, lasers, high-power microwave would be another example, and then electronic warfare. All of those technologies could do a lot to give us more defensive capacity and open up those vertical launch system cells for offensive weapons instead. The one thing that you have to do in order to leverage them, though, is you have to be able to accept that missiles are going to get closer to you before you engage them, because all of those systems are line-of-sight systems that can only, engage a missile if it's on the horizon 10 miles away, and if it's a little bit higher up, maybe 20 miles away. So you're not going to be able to engage incoming missiles with a non-kinetic weapon like that at more than 20 or 30 miles generally. So that's part of the air defense concept you have to accept. But then, stepping back to look at the big picture, the Navy's faced with a lot of hard choices in the next couple of years as it starts to figure out how to equip the surface force. And the surface force it doesn't have the clear and unambiguous mission of the undersea forces that do things for surveillance and strike and for strategic deterrence, and it doesn't necessarily have the clear missions of the carrier air wing, but it's kind of the jack of all trades. It does a lot of different things, and we depend on it for a lot of different missions, from security cooperation all the way through high-end missile defense and strike. And as a result, it's hard for it to be able to maintain that ability to work in every domain, from undersea to air and space, as well as being able to do every mission across the range of military operations. So the Navy's got to put the investment necessary to maintain the force structure capacity so it can maintain the presence. It's got to maintain the warfighting capability in the fleet that it needs in order to be effective and then deter conflict. And then it's got to be willing to sustain that over time, even in an environment where other things are going to intrude upon it. So I would advocate that the Navy needs to look carefully at these upcoming decisions and adapt the surface fleet to be able to evolve into the fleet that's able to go back on offense and develop this offensive mindset and equip it with the kinds of weapons and the kinds of sensors it needs to be able to be effective. And I think one thing I fear is that we'll just progress down the status quo. We'll simply recapitalize our existing systems as opposed to adopting new concepts that might enable us to maintain the warfighting capability we need going into the future.
Thank you. Mr. McGrath, give you the last word.
Thank you for this opportunity. My friend Ron O'Rourke at the Congressional Research Service likes to talk about...
He's watching what you say, so make sure that you don't say anything critical.
He talks about being in a new strategic era, and I think he's right. My way of putting that is great power dynamics is back on the menu. We have to begin to think differently about how conflict in this new strategic era is waged. We cannot continue to address this question with the same risk profile that we applied to campaigns and campaign analysis when we were the sole hyperpower, when there was no blue water threat to the U.S. Navy. Those aspects of that threat environment drove us to well-intentioned decisions. We removed surface-to-surface missiles from our DDG, our Arleigh Burke destroyers. We built Arleigh Burke destroyers from number 51 to number 78 with a Harpoon missile on it. Number 79 through today cannot kill another ship over the horizon by itself. We have not built a ship in the United States Navy since 1999 that can kill another ship over the horizon by itself. That decision and decisions about how to allocate missions within the portfolio, surface, subsurface, and aviation, has led to a situation in which we look at the surface force, the Navy looks at the surface force, as something that needs to be protected by the air wing. I think that needs to be questioned. I think we've put a ton of money in the last 30 years into the world's most sophisticated air defense systems. I think that we have to begin to question whether or not air supremacy or air superiority that's required for surface operations, detached surface operations, whether that can't be provided to a level of risk that is acceptable by the ships themselves. I'm not saying that we should drive 3-ship SAGs into the Taiwan Strait. I'm saying that the Chinese ISR complex is not equally as good throughout its entire volume, and that there are places within it where surface forces will be able to operate, will be able to create mayhem, and will be able to hold targets that that opponent would value at risk. We just have to think differently about that risk. Thank you.
And thank you for sharing it with us today. And with that, Mr. Courtney, if there's nothing else that you have, then we're adjourned. Yeah.
This is where the